Hi, I'm Alex Udris, and tonight we're going to take a look at Crosswind Landings on Boldmethod Live VFR. We're going to talk about the one way to land in a crosswind. People always say there's two techniques, but really I think that's a bit of clickbait, because unless you're flying a B-52 where you can swivel your landing gear, you always need to line the airplane up with the runway, with that longitudinal axis lined up with the center line before you touch down. So the real question is, when do you switch from a crab, one technique, to that side slip, the other technique? And we're going to go into that in detail. Plus, we're going to take a look at some of the common errors in a crosswind, and we're going to talk about some things that limit how much crosswind your airplane and you can handle. So tonight, Colin Cutler is our technical director. Both Corey and Swain are out flying the line, so Colin will also be managing chat. And the entire point of Live is that it's an interactive presentation. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about, or you want me to go into detail, or any questions about crosswinds, throw them out there in the chat. Colin will work them into the presentation. Okay, so I said there's really one way to land in a crosswind, and that is when you touch down, you need to be directionally aligned. That longitudinal axis needs to be aligned with the center line. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, we'll just quickly cut to the iPad, and you can see it right here. If you look at what we've got, here's a Blue Cirrus, and we're lined right up with the center line. The last thing that you want to do is be pointed sideways as you land. You don't want to be pointed into the wind. And we'll talk about that in detail in a second. So that brings up the question, how do you get there? Well, there's two ways to correct for a crosswind. One of them is a crab, when you angle the airplane into the wind. And so using our green airplane here, as opposed to flying straight, we'll kind of fly at a crab, pointed into the wind. That's the way we'd normally correct in the pattern, or we'd correct when we're on a cross country or en route. But of course, that doesn't work very well as we start to touch down. The problem is you don't want to touch down with those wheels misaligned with the center line. They need to be pointing straight down. So at some point in time, you need to switch from a crab to a side slip. Okay, yes, to a side slip. Okay, let's take a look back at the iPad, and let's take a look at what happens if we don't slip and we don't crab. What you can see is we've got wind from the left here, and that wind is just blowing us off the runway. If you could imagine maybe there's some grass or something here, you're going to end up off the downwind side of the runway. Of course, everybody knows in a crosswind you don't want to do that. If you see that runway sliding, if you start to see that center line moving away, it's time for a go-around. So, okay, what happens if we touch down in a crab? Okay, so here we are, we're crabbed into the wind. You can see the nose is not aligned with the center line of the runway. It's off a little bit. And we still have that wind coming from the left over here. So as we start flying, once the aircraft touches down, it's going to turn and weather vane into the wind. This is definitely, I think, more common than touching down without any correction. People tend to still touch down in a crab. And what's going to happen is that airplane is going to end up driving itself off the side of the runway. There's a couple things that are factoring in here. One of them is your vertical stabilizer. If you think about it, that wind is pushing on it. And that's creating a little bit of a weather vane tendency that's going to want to bring that tail around and that nose around. So now you're going to end up off the upwind side of the runway. So we definitely don't want to touch down in a crab. Okay, so what's the solution? Before we dive into this, it's something that everybody has done a million times before and we really don't think about very much. It's a turn. When you roll into a turn, you're generating both vertical and horizontal lift. But of course, you don't want to turn when you're down close to the ground. You want to try to keep the airplane perfectly aligned with your runway. So we need to figure out how we can get the airplane into a bank without allowing it to turn. And that is a side slip. Okay, so let's take a look back at the iPad. As the aircraft starts to roll into a turn, lift always points perpendicularly to the wings. So you can see as the airplane begins to bank in a coordinated turn or in a slip, lift remains perpendicular to the wings. But if we break that down into components, we're going to see a couple different parts here. First of all, we have our vertical component of lift. and that is going to counter weight. But then we also end up with that horizontal component of lift, the orange lift here. That's what causes the aircraft to turn en route. But if you have wind, let's say you've got wind coming from the left side of the screen, we can use that horizontal component of lift to counteract the wind. So the question always is, how much correction do I need in a crosswind? And the answer is, you need the amount of this to match the amount of crosswind. The amount of horizontal component of lift needs to line up with the amount of your crosswind component. When those two are equal, the aircraft will stop drifting. And so as we roll into a bank, we're going to adjust our angle of bank to get the perfect amount of horizontal component of lift. So if we take a look at that over a runway, okay, here we are, we're rolled into a bank, we have that wind, we have the wind coming off our left, and we're banked, so the horizontal component of lift is pointing left. And as the aircraft rolls out of a bank, that horizontal component of lift will start to decrease. So as we shallow the bank, the horizontal component of lift will start to decrease. And the aircraft is going to start to slide basically downwind on the runway. So you're seeing it begins to move like this because it's not strong enough to counter the wind. Then as we roll into a bank, the horizontal component of lift increases and we'll start to fly back upwind towards the runway center line. Okay, looks like we've got a question.
Okay, first question here's from John, and that has to do with this side slip that you just showed. And he said, how do I know if I'm using enough rudder in this side slip?
Okay, great question, John. First of all, rudder and your aileron are always linked. And the reason for that is we're using that aileron to control the amount of bank that we have, right? But the problem is the nose is going to want to turn around to the left. So what do? We add in opposite rudder. And so as you add, let's say in this case, if we take a look at our aircraft down in the iPad, if you take a look, we've got aileron banking us to the left. We're going to use our rudder to, aileron taking us to the left. We're going to use our rudder to counteract, I kind of drew that backwards. That rudder is going to point the nose to the right. That's the way to look at it. So essentially, which rudder would we use? Well, of course, we want the tail to swing around like that. So we're going to use a little bit of right rudder. And so this can feel a little bit awkward. Okay, so if we look at it again, our ailerons are pointing left. I want my rudder to deflect, aileron's going left, and I want my rudder to deflect to the right here. So that kind of drives my tail that way and keeps my nose perfectly aligned. So it's opposite. You're always going to roll into the wind, and you're going to add opposite rudder away from the wind. So if you have a left crosswind, you're using right rudder. If you have a right crosswind, you're using left rudder. The easiest thing to see is you're going to push the rudder so that the nose remains perfectly aligned with the center line. That's what you're looking for. You don't have to really think about, okay, do I use left or right? You just want to look out the front of the airplane and make sure that nose stays perfectly aligned with the center line. We'll take a look at that in detail in another video here in just a second. Okay, so this practice that you see right here, where the aircraft slides up and down the center line, where we move downwind and upwind, this is something that's great to do in an airplane as you're starting to develop your crosswind capability. So one of the things that we've got in our takeoff and landings course, we practice it, and it's a great thing to practice with an instructor, is to get into an aircraft and fly at a safe altitude, maybe 400 or 500 feet or a little lower if you feel comfortable, down the runway center line in landing configuration, and hold that center line in a slip with the ailerons into the wind, okay, keeping the aircraft from drifting from center line and using the rudder to keep the nose straight, and then roll the airplane out of the bank a little bit and watch yourself slide downwind, and do the opposite. Increase and allow yourself to slide upwind. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, next question is from Jose, and he wants to know, does an increase in weight make the horizontal lift difficult to handle, or does it change the amount of horizontal lift that you need to put on the airplane with that increase in weight?
Okay, so as you increase weight, you're going to need more lift on the airplane overall. And so if your lift vector is bigger, you're going to notice that you'll use different bank angles for the same amount of crosswind. So for example, when you're heavier, you're generating more lift, which means as you roll into a bank, you're going to have more horizontal component of lift. So you might not need quite as much bank to handle the same amount of crosswind. But the thing to think about is you won't really notice that as you're flying. You will see that the amounts differ, but it's really hard to tell just mechanically how much bank to use. What you really need to do is watch out the nose of the airplane and keep adding in the bank and opposite rudder until you see that drift stop. That's when you know you're set. So when I'm flying, I'm not really thinking about 2 or 3 degrees of bank or 5 or 6 degrees of bank. My eyes are focused completely outside and then scanning in to look at airspeed, but mostly outside, watching that center line, adding in more and more bank until I see the drift stop. And once that drift stops, now I know my bank angle is right. So you're right though, as your aircraft changes weight, you're going to have different components of lift. But again, you don't really have to think about that because when you do it visually, you'll see everything line up once you're lined up in a crosswind. Okay, so that does bring up a point, and one of them is, how do I know how much crosswind my aircraft can handle? And so if you think about it, we're using bank to kill the drift. And an airplane can bank quite a bit before the wings will tap the ground. You have quite a few degrees of bank. You would never need that much in a crosswind. So the problem that we run into comes down to our rudder. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens when we start to run out of rudder. We'll head down to the iPad again. As the aircraft starts to slow down, think about it, in a flare, the aircraft is slowing down. So the rudder has less airflow. You don't have quite as much airflow going over the rudder. And so as that happens, your deflections are going to increase. So as opposed to maybe being deflected like this, you'll end up having to deflect more as you get slower. And eventually, you're going to run out of rudder effectiveness. And you'll know that that's happening because you have full rudder in and you can no longer keep the nose aligned with the runway center line. With that full rudder in, you'll see that the nose starts to turn back into the wind. Essentially, the aircraft is moving out of a slip and back into a turn. And the slower you get, the more that will happen. So the problem really comes down to airspeed and your rudder's effectiveness. Okay, so let's say you feel comfortable with your ability to land in a crosswind, but you find that the airplane is limited out by rudder. What can you do? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. What you can do is increase your final approach speed. The easiest way to do that is to not land with full flaps. And you'll see many airplanes, like a Cessna 172, especially the old ones with 40 degrees of flaps, they'll recommend that you do not use full flaps in a crosswind landing. And that's both because your final approach speed is so slow that the crosswind affects you more, and that increase in airspeed makes your rudder more effective so that you can handle more crosswind. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, next up, I think this is a timely one from Mark that's going to lead into your next image, Alex. He says, so you flare in this configuration land on one wheel?
That is exactly right. So, you think about that perfect touchdown, and in a calm wind day, it's 2 mains and then the nose. But the reality is if there is any crosswind, you're not going to land with both mains at the same time. They're going to land slightly apart. How much depends on your airplane. When you're flying a light airplane, especially one that is light and slow, you'll really notice that upwind, downwind, nose wheel landing. We'll look at that in a second. When you're flying a faster airplane or a heavier airplane, you tend to notice it a little bit less. But essentially, you're touching the airplane down in that side slip. So let's take a look at that. Let's go take a look at the touchdown. And you can see this here, and it isn't, it's not a huge amount of difference, but it's just a few inches, but it's enough to notice it. If you look, your first wheel that you're going to touch down on is your upwind main. And you're going to find that your downwind main and your nose wheel should still be in the air. And as you do that, you're not going to release your aileron correction. You're going to keep that aileron into the wind, and you're going to keep that rudder correction in until the aircraft naturally wants to stop flying. If you think about it, if you take a look at what's happening here as you're rolling out, you've got your upwind aileron pointed up. It's keeping that wing down, okay? Then you've got your downwind aileron pointing down. That's essentially kind of rolling you in. And as you get slower, you're going to need to increase the deflection on both of those ailerons. So you would think, a lot of people think, once this wheel touches down, then I want to release my control input so everything else can touch down. It's the exact opposite. You want to keep increasing your control inputs. Essentially, you'll end up taking your aileron all the way to the stop, and this downwind main wheel will touch down once the airplane stops flying. Once it gets slow enough, it will naturally come down. And then the last wheel to come down is a nose wheel. That will come down. But then as you roll out, you should roll out with your control stick or your yoke fully into the wind. When we talk about crosswind errors, one of them is not recognizing drift, and that just takes practice. But one of the biggest problems that you see in a crosswind is that we stop flying once one or all of the wheels are on the ground, and that results in loss of directional control. Okay, looks like we have another question.
Okay, next up with this three-wheel landing, Flight Cal wants to know, when I touch down, I'm able to avoid a side load, but all the wheels hit at close to the same time. I don't get the upwind wheel down, then the downwind, then the nose. How do I fix that? More airspeed?
First of all, that's a great question. It depends on your airplane, and you may not need to fix it. You may not be doing anything wrong. I know for us, when I was flying the Warrior, the PA-28, our final approach speed, it's been a few years, but I think it was 63. Colin, am I right there? 63
right.
knots was right over the runway. And we were flying that in North Dakota where 25-knot winds were really common. So with that slow final approach speed, and oftentimes 15-knot crosswind components, we really noticed that 1, 2, 3. That's a lot of it. When your final approach speed is really low, you're really going to notice the 1, 2, 3 set down. Okay, so now most of my time is in a Cirrus SR22 Turbo. Our final approach speed is a lot faster. I'm touching down at 80 knots instead of 63, and that makes a huge difference when it comes down to crosswind component. But the key is you don't want to change your touchdown speed to try to get the perfect 1, 2, 3. You want to fly your normal final approach speed for your configuration. Okay, so for example, in the SR22, our final approach speed at full flaps is going to be between 80 and 85 knots. If I had to reduce flaps because the crosswinds are really strong, then it would be 85 to 90 knots at 50% flaps, or 90 to 95 knots at 0% flaps. But what I don't want to do is fly an exceptionally slow final to try to get that 1, 2, 3, because I'm flying really slow. Definitely in the region of reverse command and right by the stall speed. And you don't want to stall the aircraft early onto the ground. You also don't want to fly the aircraft artificially too fast. So what you will see sometimes is people will say, okay, I need to increase my rudder effectiveness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my flaps in full, but I'm going to really crank my final approach speed. That doesn't work very well either, because you still have to bleed off all of that airspeed for the airplane to touch down. And if you touch down fast, you're going to touch down flat and increase your chance of porpoising. So what I tell people is in a crosswind, if it's not gusty, you're going to fly your standard final approach speeds. And if you're having a hard time with rudder, if the rudder just isn't effective enough, you find yourself all the way at the stop, the best way to fix that is to fly a reduced flap landing and then use that final approach speed, which will be a little bit faster, means you have more rudder effectiveness. And again, coming down to whether you're feeling the 1, 2, 3, a lot of that depends on how strong the crosswind is. I know when we're filming, oftentimes I'm looking for that perfect 1, 2, 3 landing, and in the Cirrus, it takes quite a bit of crosswind. I would say maybe 13 or plus knots of direct crosswind component before you really notice the 1, 2, 3 landing. In the Warrior, 7 knots of direct crosswind, and you can really notice it. So it has a little bit to do with airplane speed there. Okay, let's take a look at this. We're going to go fly a full pattern. And what we're going to do is walk through all of our corrections. And we're going to talk about how we transition from both a crab into the slip and then how we manage that through touchdown. And I think that'll help everybody kind of see what's happening. And even though this is flown in a Cirrus SR-22, the technique is the same. If you're flying a 172 or a Bonanza or a Twin, a Seminole, it's all really the same. And if you can land a single and a crosswind and you're active on the rudders, you'll find that that technique transfers well to pretty much any other airplane. So we'll start by entering the pattern. If we take a look at the wing shot, we're in Durango, Colorado here. You can see the runway, and we're going to plan on landing at the aiming point markers, which you'll see are right there. We're entering the pattern with our flaps clean. You'll notice my flaps aren't down yet. So in the Cirrus, I've got my downwind power setting about 41%, and I'm flying about 110 knots. Once I add my first set of flaps, flaps 50, that will slow me down. So let's go ahead and start this. So we're on the downwind leg of the pattern, and the wind is a crosswind blowing across the runway. I'll pause it right here. If you can imagine, the wind is coming right out of here. You can see it on the wind indicator in the lower left corner of our HUD there. Okay, so you'll notice that I am definitely crabbed into the wind on downwind. One of the common mistakes that I see, especially in mountainous areas and on lighter wind days, is people will assume that the downwind correction is going to match the correction at the surface. Sometimes that's the case. Other times you could end up in an inversion. I've flown cases, especially with a temperature inversion that's really low in Grand Forks, where I've had correction to the right in the pattern, and then back to the right, essentially the opposite once I'm on final. And so one of the things to think about is you're on downwind. Look at the crosswind and then ask yourself, okay, is this going to match up with what's going to happen when I line up on the runway? What's the METAR saying? Because winds can be tricky. They're not always very constant. They can be strong at altitude and light at the surface. They can be light at altitude and strong at the surface. And you really have to kind of plan your pattern about it. And we'll see that as we start our turn to base. Okay, so you can see going back to the iPad as we come through downwind, I've got about 10 degrees of right correction. And today, the winds are out of 335 at 22, and we're landing on runway 3. So it's about a 20-knot crosswind component, and the winds are fairly steady all the way from the surface to pattern altitude. Okay, you can see here we're at midfield, so I'm going to drop my flaps, and you can see my flaps have come down to my downwind flap setting of 50%, and that will slow me down in the Cirrus to 100 knots. And as we move back to the HUD, you can see my airspeed starting to slow. That setting works in the Cirrus. Other airplanes will have different power settings, but the key thing is fly your standard power setting. And here, as we come abeam, let me rewind back just a little bit, you can see that we're abeam my touchdown point. That's the 1,000-foot or aiming point markers. That's where I want to touch down today. I'm going to start my power reduction. People think that you should start your power reduction abeam the end of the runway, but that's only true if you want to land on the end of the runway, which I never really want to. Instead, you're going to start your power reduction when you're abeam your touchdown point. And I almost always use the aiming point markers, unless for some reason, if the runway doesn't have them, I'll use a stripe, or if I'm simulating a short field, but I always like to use those. Okay, so as we go back to the HUD, you'll see that I've gone from 40 to 30%. That's my standard power setting in the Cirrus SR-22 Turbo. It works for just about any weight, and I'm going to hold that throughout the entire landing, basically right to touchdown. You can see we've now departed pattern altitude, and I'm letting trim do the work here. I've already have the airplane trimmed out for 100 knots, and I'm going to fly until I hit 45 degrees from that touchdown point right there and start my base turn. And I'm going to put in my base flaps. In the Cirrus, that's 100% flaps. You can see those flaps are coming down right there. Now, this base leg is going to be really quick, and that's because you can see now I've got a 22-knot tailwind. So this is another problem that we run into when we're talking about crosswinds. You really need a good final approach to set up and nail a crosswind landing. If you roll out way off runway centerline, it makes it very hard to dial in any sort of a crab or a slip. So a lot of times when we see bad crosswind landings, they're starting really in the downwind or the base leg. So one of the things that I always told my students when I was teaching, what I always knew, when I would start the turn to the base, I would say, okay, turning base with a tailwind, or turning base with a headwind. And that way I could think about it. Okay, with a tailwind, it's going to be shorter. With a headwind, it's going to be longer. And it just gets me thinking about it. Oftentimes, it's just that we weren't even really expecting a short base leg. And then all of a sudden you look out and you're like, oh, wow, I've already flown past center line. So it always helps to think about that as you start that base leg turn. Okay, back to the iPad. You can see in just a second, we're going to roll wings level. We won't be very long. I still have about a 5-degree crab angle, not a lot, but a little bit. And now I'm already starting my turn onto final approach. Okay, and I've bugged runway heading here. You can see that bug, or the blue bug on runway 3. And here comes the runway. Now my goal is to roll out with a crab angle. And you can see so far this has worked out pretty good. If you look at the runway, we're basically kind of lined up with it coming into a crab angle. So I timed the turns right. That's going to help set up our landing. Okay, and as we continue to go, you can see we're bouncing around a little bit. Now you can really see that crab angle. So let's take a look and draw that out. If you look at the nose, okay, I'm pointing off like that. And then if you look at the runway, it's coming down like that. So you can see how far off we are. But one thing you'll notice, if you look at that runway center line, it's vertical. It's straight up and down. If I'm looking at it with my head, you can see that runway center line is perfectly aligned. This part of the runway is perfectly aligned with that part of the runway. That lets me know that I'm still on center line. You know, and at Durango and many airports, you'll have some hints. You can actually see where they've cut out some of the trees for the approach lighting system, and I can use that to imagine the runway center line on my way in. But this tells me I'm lined up, even though my nose is pointing off to the left, which is countering that left crosswind. There's a couple other things to keep in mind here. You can tell, first of all, you see this big ridge right here. Whether or not the field is reporting gusty winds, I'm going to assume that I'm going to end up with some because I'm going to get some terrain. You know, the wind's going to come down and get turbulent in that terrain. So I'm looking at that. I'm also looking at the fact that there's kind of a valley right here. So if you think about it, the winds here in Durango, they're going to come up the valley, roll across, and then back down. So I'm expecting that my crosswind correction is going to have to change a lot. Okay, so that's one of the things that people think about. When we're on a crosswind, it's not stick it and forget it most of the time. Usually the winds are shifting as you get down towards the surface, as you're going through turbulence. So really, people say you're dancing on the controls. And that's the key. The problem is, especially when you're new with the crosswind, you kind of have this aggressive grip. You know, you're stressed, you're ultra tense, you're staring down the runway, and that tends to lead people to really hold on to the yoke tight and to stiffen up their leg muscles. And then you start to see them lean forward in the airplane. You know, they're kind of hunched over the control panel staring. That entire posture makes it very hard to stay light and fast on the controls. And actually, one of the instructors at Independence Aviation, as I was getting checked out in the Cirrus, gave me a great technique for that. Is I started to lean forward and kind of get into that, you know, focused posture. He's like, put a tennis ball behind your back and hold the tennis ball against the seat. That forces you to stay back in your seat. Now, not only does that help with the sight picture, but it mentally requires you to sit up and relax. And that's one of the tough things about a crosswind landing. You have to be relaxed to really stick it well because the winds are constantly changing. Your airspeed starts slowing down. And so as you slow down, your control inputs are going to increase. As the crosswind dies off, as a gust dies off, you're going to take the crosswind correction out a little bit. And you're moving your ailerons and rudders in a coordinated fashion. Not that the airplane's coordinated, they're just moving both at the same time. As you roll out of a little aileron, you'll let out a little rudder. As you roll in a little aileron, you'll add some rudder. How much? Enough to keep that nose, essentially, once you roll into your slip, pointed down the runway. So we'll take a look at this. We'll go back to the iPad, and you're going to watch my final approach as I fly in from a crab. You can see we've got about a 10-degree crab angle, and we're bouncing around in the wind. And then in a second here, we're going to start transitioning to a slip. And I'm already kind of rehearsing this in my head. You know, okay, I'm going to add left aileron and right rudder as I get into the slip. And I tend to roll in on about a short final. So you can see this is where we're starting that transition, and you'll see the nose line up here in just a second. Okay, we're swinging the nose in, and we're adding the stick. So let's watch that again. And if you see up here in the right corner, you'll see my control inputs as I'm doing this. Okay, so as I start to roll in, you can see that right rudder's increasing and my stick is turning off to the left. And I've slowed this down. You can see that we're aligned. We're still getting hit by some gusts, so you can see I'm increasing my bank angle to get back on center line. And then I'm going to roll a little out, but I'm lined up right down the center line. This is when I've switched from a crab to a forward slip. And I'm going to hold this all the way through to touchdown. Here's my touchdown. Okay, you'll see 1, 2, 3. So if you watch that again, you're coming in, up one wheel, down one wheel, and then nose. When that nose comes down, I'm actually not setting the nose down. I still have full back pressure on the stick, and I'm essentially just keeping that back pressure is doing a couple things. It keeps the nose touchdown light. It also gives me aerodynamic braking, so I don't have to use my wheel brakes, which is much more stable. And then even though the airplane is down now, I'm keeping that pressure in because the airplane's still flying. So if we go back to that, let's watch as we start to roll out. You'll see my aileron here in a second. And the gusts are pushing me around just a little bit on center line, but I'm making fast corrections to get back on. And there you go, you can see it. That aileron is fully deflected into the wind. I've got all left aileron, essentially, keeping the aircraft from being blown off. Again, one of the biggest mistakes is that people let out their correction right here. As soon as they feel the airplane touch down, the yoke goes back to neutral, the rudder pedals go back to neutral, and either you're going to start drifting off the runway that way, or you might find that the airplane starts to weather vane and goes off this way, depending on how you're using the rudders. But the key thing is to keep that correction in. And if you watch that touchdown, the 1, 2, 3, it still happens fast. I mean, we have a 20-knot crosswind component. 1, 2, 3. But you can definitely feel it, piece by piece by piece. And we're going to keep these corrections in. We're going to keep this aileron correction in essentially all the way until we slow down to taxi speed. And from there, we're going to use our crosswind correction in a taxi until we get into the ramp. Especially on gusty days, you'll really notice that crosswind correction helps. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Okay, we've got a whole bunch of questions here, so we're going to get started with Steven. And his question is, how far from the threshold do you go from a crab to a slip?
That's a great question. I say that too much, but that really is a great question because it completely depends on when you feel like you need the time to get that slip dialed in. So one of the reasons, you could slip the airplane all the way down final. There's nothing wrong with that. The reason we don't is because it typically isn't as comfortable for passengers. But there is absolutely nothing wrong with flying all the way down to final in a side slip. And so for me, typically I'm going to transition from a crab to a slip, as I said, on short final, because I can usually do it in a 1, 2, 3. It takes about 3 seconds to roll in and feel comfortable. But let's go back and rewind along final approach. So I'm going to bring you back out on final. And if you take a look at it, one of the things, if I don't feel like my crosswind proficiency is quite where I want it, if I'm still feeling a bit uncomfortable, I might roll in a little bit earlier, maybe on final approach or mid-final approach. And there's a couple reasons. That will give me time to line up, and I can keep adjusting that correction as I go through changing winds. So one of the things I tell people is, if we get all the way to the runway, okay, and you wait to put it in right here, and you touch down and you're still drifting, then you probably put your side slip in too late. And then in that case, you want to put it in a little bit earlier. And the key thing to keep in mind is you can never put it in. As I said, you'll never put it in too early. It's great practice, and especially when I'm getting back into high wind crosswind landings, or if I'm just trying to build up some proficiency, really, I find that most of the practice is best done in that slip. That's the part that people feel the most uncomfortable with. Most people are pretty good at crabbing and holding the center line, but the slip where you're using uncoordinated rudder and aileron, it just doesn't feel natural. So again, my thought is start with it early, maybe halfway down final or right when you roll out on final, and then practice that transition from the crab to the slip, and as you can do it quicker and quicker, more and more quickly, you can bring it in closer to the runway. Last thing on that, when we're landing in a really strong, gusty crosswind, I'm going to roll in early into that side slip. There's been times when we're landing in really strong gusty winds in Kansas, 40-knot winds, and I am in that forward slip essentially as soon as the airplane hits final. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, next up, the question is, I've trouble maintaining bank when I'm flaring. My landings in a crosswind are too abrupt and hard. What advice do you have?
Okay, so probably there's a couple things that can happen here. First of all, if you think about the airplane, it's slowing down as you go through the flare. And so the slower the airplane gets, the more correction you're going to need. So one common error that we typically see is that people will keep that correction in kind of frozen. Whatever they were using on final, that's what they hold throughout the flare. If your correction is decreasing and the wind isn't dying out, you've got a problem, because the slower you get to compensate for the wind, the more correction you're going to need to add. So think about that. That could be one of the issues. Most common thing I see is people start to lose that crosswind correction as they get into the flare. And part of that is they just feel uncomfortable with the sight picture of being in a bank close to the ground. Another problem is typically the grip on the yoke. And when we're gripping the yoke or the stick really tightly, it makes it hard to control that bank angle and to move the yoke smoothly. So one of the other things that you can think about is loosening up the grip. People say, put a pencil maybe between your fingers as you're holding on to the stick. That can help. I typically try to use my fingertips as opposed to my palm. If I know that I'm holding onto the stick too tight, I'll just grip it with my fingertips. It makes it harder for me to really tense up my muscles and exert pressure. But again, the most common thing that I see in a crosswind, especially with a student, if they're having abrupt landings, it's typically because they've let that bank angle come out. We started out in a slip, and we've gotten rid of it in the flare, and we're going to touch down. So consciously think about increasing that correction. And if you do it right, you're going to see that correction increase all the way as you touch down. It'll be really close to full in a good crosswind. And then you'll just roll it all the way in gently and roll out down the runway with the yoke or the stick full over. And that's a sign of a perfect crosswind landing. Okay, looks like we got another question.
Okay, next up, when do I have too much bank in a slip?
Okay, we can go back and there's an animation for that. Let me tab back to it really quick. Okay, let's go to the iPad. Bank is going to control your drift. Rudder is just there to keep the airplane's nose aligned with the center line. Okay, so if the airplane starts moving away from the center line, like you can see here, right here, the airplane is moving downwind. This scenario, what you're seeing right here, where the airplane starts drifting downwind, that means that you don't have enough bank. Okay? The opposite, if the airplane's moving upwind, that means that you have too much bank. So if you see yourself start to get blown away from the center line, I'd say this is the most common problem initially, where the wind is pushing you away from the runway. You're going to need more bank. And you're going to increase that bank until you fly yourself back to the center line. And then you're going to take a little bit out to hold the runway center line. So here we kind of exaggerate and then take a little bit out to hold the runway center line. And that is where you have perfect bank. The nose, all you're doing is using rudder to keep this nose pointed straight down the runway. So the rudder will be constantly changing. And what you want to see is that those stripes are perfectly vertically aligned. And you can see that. I'll jump over really quick to the video. If you look at final, take it down to the runway, you can see right here, we're still in the air, that these stripes are perfectly vertically aligned. if we were to draw a line, right down the airport, let me make that line just a little bit easier to see. You can see that the stripes are basically vertical. That's when you know you've got enough rudder. If you were to find yourself somewhere over here, moving this way, the nose is still straight, but you find yourself drifting to the right, that means, because we have a crosswind, if you look coming out of the left, that means we need more bank angle. And if you find yourself moving upwind, then you need a little bit less bank angle. Okay, next question.
Okay, next one's from Mark, and he wants to know, if I'm running out of rudder, is adding a touch of power a good option to get more rudder effectiveness?
That's a great idea. First of all, what you'll find is a little bit of power is going to increase airflow over the airplane. And that can increase the airflow over the rudder, which means your rudder is a little bit more effective. It depends on the airplane. Some singles are better with it than others, but there's something you want to be a little bit careful about here. And that is that you don't want your final approach speed to increase too much over your planned approach speed. Even a knot or two can cause float. And the other thing is you want to take that power out as you touch down. People try to touch down with power and they forget to take the power out. And now you find the airplane wants to lift back off or skip down the runway. So if you have just a little bit of power, you're carrying a couple knots of airspeed, that's fine, and that'll help increase your effectiveness. But if you find that you're really close to the stop, and that's what I really find the issue is, people get themselves like right up against that rudder stop. What that really means is that you probably need to take out some flaps and fly a faster final approach. People always practice full flap landings, and that's great for the tires and it's great for the brakes, but most of the runways that we land on could handle no flap landings. Most of us are landing on runways that are 4,000, 5,000 feet long oftentimes, and even in the Cirrus, we can get which is a fast final approach speed. I can get the airplane stopped, no problem, in a no flap landing on 3,000 feet. So one of the things that I tell people is practice reduced flap landings in normal conditions when there isn't a lot of wind. Because if you find yourself in a really strong crosswind and you just are having a hard time, that rudder just doesn't seem to have enough effectiveness and you're using a lot of it, you keep hitting the stop, the best thing you can do is take out a set of flaps on the next pattern. Don't take it out on final, fly another pattern, bring the flaps up, and then take it in. Okay, we got another question.
Okay, next up from Caitlin, she wants to know, when there are crosswind gusts, is there a special technique to prepare for the gusts?
Be light on the controls. Now, the one thing that you can do is we always follow our standard gust rule. If you have a 10 knot gust, it's 10 gusting to 20. You want to add half the gust factor to your final approach speed. So if your normal final approach speed is 70 knots, the winds are 10 gusting to 20, half of that 10 knots would be 5. Add 5 knots to 70, your final approach speed is 75. So that right there will help you out. That'll counter out the fact that as those gusts die out, you'll drop a little closer to stall speed. So that gives you some margin on stall speed. But the gusts are also going to affect the crosswind strength and the amount of horizontal component of lift that you need. And so the easiest thing to do, or the only thing to do there really, is to stay light on the controls. And that's again where I say sit up in the chair, keep a light grip on the yoke, and dance on the rudder pedals. It takes practice. It takes practice to develop that sight picture, and it takes practice to develop that control feel so that you can easily move the rudder pedals and the stick in opposite directions. And so as you're trying to get used to that, if that's something that you're struggling with, which everybody does as they're learning crosswinds, grab an instructor, go out there and find some of those gusty crosswinds, and don't even worry about landing. Just line yourself up and fly down final, then do a go around. Line yourself up, fly down final, do a go around, and just keep practicing. It's a great way to get used to moving the rudders and then moving the stick. And then once you feel comfortable, you feel like you can keep everything lined up, then start touching the airplane down. One of the problems we have in training is we try to stick every landing. And when you're new or when you're learning a technique, it's pretty hard to stick every landing. What you really need to do is kind of just get used to the movement of the controls. So once you kind of take that out of your mind and say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to even worry about sticking the landing. I'm just going to fly it all the way down, do a go around and do it again. It really can build your proficiency and comfort. Okay, next question.
All right, next up, and we still have quite a few here. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Next question is, how do I know when I should flare in a crosswind landing?
So this is something, it feels like it should be different, but it really isn't. You still want to flare at the same height in a crosswind landing. Part of the problem in a crosswind landing is that we're so focused on the correction that it's hard to see that sight picture looking down the nose of the runway and recognize when the airplane should flare. And there's a couple techniques that we can use to recognize a flare. One of them is building height. So let's go back to our video here. I think you can kind of see it. There aren't many buildings by the end of the runway here, but you can kind of tell those buildings off in the distance. As you start to feel like you're descending through building height, that's a good time to start bringing the airplane into the flare. The other thing that you will see is that the width of the runway will change very quickly. And you can see how it, just in a few seconds, it starts to zoom. So I'll clear that. I'll draw that line a little bit lighter. You can see how that runway is fairly small there. And as we fly in, all of a sudden it'll get much, much wider. And if you look at it, let's keep going, right about flare height, which will be right here, you can see how much bigger it's gotten. So as you start to see the runway zoom out, or you can watch it here, that's even easier to see. As we pull it back, you can see it's thinner. And we've got an example of that, both in the landings course, and if you take a look on the website, there's a picture of the runway width zooming, and you can see it really, really well. But as you start to see the runway zoom out in your peripheral vision, that lets you know you want to start to flare. As you see yourself descending through building height, that lets you know that you want to flare. It's the same height that you would flare on a normal no-wind landing. The reason it becomes kind of difficult in a crosswind landing is that we're so focused on that bank angle in the rudder, we just don't even think about how high we are. It's just not entering our mind. And a lot of that just takes practice. Once you get comfortable with controlling the slip, with controlling the crosswind, you can start to open your mind up and start to think about, oh, okay, yep, looks like I'm about flare height, and that becomes more natural. Okay, next question.
All right, next up from Frank, he wants to know, how do you go about setting personal crosswind maximums?
So that all comes with experience, and it depends on the kind of runway. First of all, if you haven't been flying in a crosswind for a while, I always recommend grabbing a flight instructor and going up and pushing your limits with them. Don't push your limits initially on your own. A flight instructor can make sure that you don't have any bad habits, that you can recognize when you're drifting and when you're not, that can help you out as you're struggling through gusts. But find a day that's windy and go up and grab your instructor. But then one of the things that I always tell people is keep track of crosswinds, especially when you're new, and how your landings went. You know, if you find yourself, nailing a 8-knot crosswind component, put that in your logbook. And kind of just think about, okay, yep, I feel really comfortable with the 8 knots. It was gusty. That way you can kind of remember it, because you start to look back, you'll ask the question, okay, was that 10 knots? Was that 5 knots? I can't remember what I was landing in. Recording that really makes a big difference. But then to develop that technique, first of all, stretch your limits with an instructor, and then as you start to feel comfortable in crosswinds, then I start to go out and I'll just go down and fly down final and see how well I can maintain that directional control, how well I can keep the airplane aligned. And one thing that you always know is you are ready for a go around, even after you've touched down. If things start to go bad, if you end up, a gust dies off and you really find yourself moving on the runway, power up and take the airplane around. A good landing always is ready for a good go-around. I know it kind of sounds cliche, but it's the truth. When I'm out practicing, there's definitely been some times we worked in the mountains and some gusty winds. I do a lot more go-arounds than I do landings because I'm trying to stick them well. I'm not trying to figure out how many times I can get the tires to touch the ground. I'm trying to, develop that proficiency to keep the airplane aligned. And then one of the other things I always caution people, be careful when you're dealing with inclement runway conditions. And I know it makes common sense, but you even see that places like Laramie. You'll see accomplished pilots go off the runway that have landed in Laramie in strong winds in the summer, but the runway's dry. And then you go in there in the winter and there's snow and black ice, and the ability to handle a crosswind is greatly diminished. So one of the things I always tell people, if the runway is wet, if the runway is asphalt and has just been repaved, it can be very slick. If the runway is contaminated with snow or ice, cut that crosswind component way back, because you could find, even with correct corrections, you just can't keep the airplane on the runway. Okay, next question.
All right, we've got time for one more here, and that comes from Flight Cal, and he wants to know, when I'm in a side slip, since it's not coordinated, is getting into a spin something to be concerned about?
Good question. Let's take a look actually, and I'm going to go back to, let's see, let's switch back to the iPad, and I'm going to go back to, okay. So when we're in a slip, and this isn't the best drawing for it, but you can kind of see it. The animator, Colin, did not bother showing us the ailerons in here, so
Wasn't
I'm going
prepared
to
for
have to
that
draw
one.
those. But he's not a miracle worker. But let's take a look at this. So this wing, the outside wing, is high, okay? And so what that really means is this aileron is going to be down a little bit, okay? And that low wing's aileron's going to be up a little bit. So if we look at this, there's a high angle of attack here and a lower angle of attack on the lower wing. So as the aircraft gets close to a stall, the outside wing, this high wing, will stall first because it's at a higher angle of attack. And as that happens, you'll see this wing tends to drop. So when the aircraft is in a slip, even though the airplane isn't coordinated, before it enters a spin, it's going to roll toward wings level. And so that's one of the reasons why slips are an acceptable maneuver on final. Because if the aircraft was to enter a stall, the first tendency is to roll back towards level. Now, that does not mean that you want to hold those corrections in and stall the airplane on short final, because if you do keep the uncoordinated corrections in and stall the airplane and leave them in, it will then roll through level and into a spin. But on normally certified airplanes, when you stall in a slip, it's going to roll itself generally very gently towards level, and simply releasing the control inputs will recoordinate the airplane and you can fly out. If you're in a skid, the opposite situation, a good example of that would be the base to final turn, where you overshoot and you jam in a whole bunch of rudder and your nose is pointed out to the outside. That's the opposite. When you stall, you're going to roll towards the low wing and you'll enter a spin very, very quickly. But typically on a slip, the airplane's going to roll back towards wings level. And all you got to do is coordinate those control inputs and you'll fly right out of the stall. Okay, there's a couple housekeeping items. Our next show, we're moving the date. It'll be 2 weeks from now, but on Wednesday and Thursday. So Wednesday will be the VFR and IFR topics, and then Thursday will be the pro pilot topic. And that's because we're doing some filming on Tuesday with the Air Force. I don't want to say what it is yet because I don't want to jinx it, but we're very much looking forward to it. In the description, there's a couple links. The first link is to our takeoffs and landings course. And it goes through all of this. It goes through crosswinds. We fly down the runway and drift down and up. We demonstrate, that transition from a crab to a slip. We talk about landing on upslope runways. We talk about landing on with partial flap settings. We talk about how to identify that perfect flare height, how to adjust your final approach speed, how to handle high density altitude. It's got a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you haven't taken a look at that course, I would absolutely check out that link. It runs on your computer, Android devices through the browser, and then also via iOS, iPad, and iPhone apps. The second link is to our next video, which is going to be IFR obstacle departure procedures. We flew 2 of them. One is a graphical departure procedure in Astoria, low weather on the coast of Oregon, and then the other one is a textual obstacle departure procedure out of Eugene in low weather. So even if you're not an IFR pilot but want to see how we might fly an obstacle departure procedure, I think that'll be a great video. We'll be starting that at the top of the hour. And then finally, our last link is to comments. If you have any ideas, things you'd like to hear us talk about, or any suggestions for the show, please let us know. We always like to have those. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you in a couple weeks.